Hi, folks. Welcome again to the Harris Recording Studio. Uh, what you see behind me is the city of Verdun in 1916. This is in the midst of the war. Verdun is going to be hit several times. And in World War One, parts of the area around Verdun are still not farmable. Parts of it there are so many unexploded mines, even after 100 years, 100 plus years, there's still pieces that you can't go through. So this town, which has now been rebuilt, is still very much marred by the after effects of World War One. World War One has a very long reach. This war is going to affect issues in the Middle East, even now. It certainly shapes the questions of Central Europe, and certainly Russia's fortunes were shaped by this war. Our attitudes towards war, our tactics in war, are very much shaped by what happened in this war. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at what happens in World War One. We are going to be looking at it from a couple of different angles, and we should get through most of the war in this video. Is my favorite map of World War One. I like this one because it kind of shows you what happens. Now, that alliance system that we talked about that comes out when Kaiser Wilhelm II knocks down Bismarck's kind of alliance system, his house of cards, doesn't actually take a root, and that's not actually going to be the sides in the First World War. The sides in the First World War are actually going to be a little bit different. And what you see here on this map are those sides. First off, over here in the green is the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, and Russia. Those three constituted the Triple Entente before the war. Serbia will also be, of course, part of the reason that the war starts, which is one of the reasons why they're going to be certainly on the Allied side. The United States will later enter the war, and so will Italy. Italy will enter in 1916 and the United States in 1917, as we will see. Those in dark green attempt to be neutral. Many of them don't manage it. They wind up having to be on the Allied side simply because of other people running into their countries. And those you see in gray will actually be neutral in the war. Notice that Spain, which has been such a major power in world events, certainly in European events for a lot of what we've talked about this semester, is not going to be here. And the same is true, but Switzerland is going to manage to stay in neutral, and the Netherlands, because nobody needs to go through her. So here are your basics. The orange are going to be Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, will join with them, which is a really interesting piece of business, since the Austrians and the Turks really hate each other. Even now, they don't like each other. And Bulgaria, which was relatively new country at the time. So this is your Central and Allied powers. Now, this is one of your lists for the final. So you want to make certain that you get these and that you get these sorted out. Please note where Italy is in this war, because Italy is on the Allied side, not on the side with Germany, which will change during the Second World War. So please be aware of that. Now, one of the things that's fascinating when we look at World War One is the reactions to the war being declared are not really what we expect them to be. We expect people to be dismayed at the declaration of war, and some are, but overwhelmingly in Europe, there is not a sense of, oh, gloom and doom. The reason I started with you Sir Edward Grey at the end of the last video is that Sir Edward Grey is going to perceive the destruction that World War One will bring to Europe, and that the lamps were going out, and it would not be the same. Most of Europe doesn't think that. There's a lot of excitement about going to war. Oh, yay, let's go to war. And it'll be grand, and we'll be home by Christmas, and we'll have lots and lots of glory and good stories to tell, like all of our ancestors would have. And we'll just wipe the floor with them. And this is being said on both sides of the aisle. The Germans think this, the French think this, the British think this. Everybody thinks this, okay? And part of that is because their last few experiences with war have been, well, pretty short. Franco-Prussian War between the French and the Prussians, right before we get the German Empire declared, was a matter of weeks. It's declared in July, but the fighting's over by January. So the idea that they would be home by Christmas is not all that far-fetched for them. And even we go back right before that, we go to the Austrian and Prussian War that creates the North German Confederation in the 1860s. It's called the 6 Weeks War. 6 weeks. So, and actually, that's what the Schlieffen Plan called for. 6 weeks to take Paris. And then we'll deal with the Russians. We'll be home in a couple of months. Done. And we'll go back to life. It's normal. Nobody expects total war. Nobody. Everybody expects a couple of weeks. Home by Christmas. And that's actually embodied in one of the first poems that I want to kind of share with you. Poetry of World War One. This is going to be a very, very literary war, partly because they have a lot of time on their hands in the trenches. But even before that, it is. And the first of these that I want to share with you is by Rupert Brooke. Now, Rupert Brooke is sometimes called the fair-haired boy. He was blonde-headed and blue-eyed and all kinds of manliness and awards at school. And if you go to Britain now, there's a pub called the Rupert Brooke. And he's going to write a lot of poems. Most famously, he's going to write this poem called Peace, 1914. And this poem I'm not going to read all of, but I want you to hear kind of the tone of it. Now God be thanked, who has matched us with this hour, and caught our youth, and wakened us from sleeping. Wait a minute. He woke us up? We're thanking God for going to war? Oh dear. But that's the perspective. With hand made sure, clear eye, and sharpened power, to turn as swimmers leap into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honor could not move, and half men with their dirty songs and dreary, and all the little emptiness of love. He's not going to miss love. He thinks the world is cold and old, and we need war to wake us up. Cleanness leaping? The war is clean? The war is going to be simple and clear and show us who the virtues are. Oh, we have known shame. We have found release there, where there's no ill, no grief, but sleep has mending. Naught broken save this body, lost but breath. Nothing to shake the laughing heart's long peace there, but only agony. And the agony isn't war. The agony is peace. And that has an ending. And the worst friend and enemy is but death. Death. Oh. Could be okay. It's a really odd little poem. And it's not a little poem. It's got a lot more stanzas than this that I'm just sharing too. But it gives you the sense of they're excited about war and death has no fear for them. They want to die gloriously in battle. And that's a very old notion, and one that, quite frankly, is going to die with this war. Nobody goes into the Second World War wanting it, because all the guys who are leading things in the Second World War are, quite frankly, veterans of World War I. And their experience in World War I shapes what they want in World War II. So that's what Rupert Brooke has to show us. But he's not the only poet we're going to encounter. So what happens? Why aren't they home by Christmas? Well, the Schlieffenplan goes wrong. So wrong that it's not even a plan anymore. First off, the Germans had never counted on the Belgians actually fighting them. Who knew that the Belgians could fight? Furthermore, they never banked on the British involvement, which is a really odd sort of business. And I have to stop my music because it's messing with the recording. I'll come back to it in a minute. The Schlieffenplan called to go through Belgium, but the Belgians fought, and the Belgians slowed down the Germans in a way that the Germans could not expect. Furthermore, the British get there pretty quickly to reinforce the Belgians, and the Germans don't even know what to do with that. Furthermore, the British are actually very, very well prepared to fight the last war. The last war they fought was in South Africa. It was the Boer War. It was a guerrilla war, and they trained their men well to be sharpshooters. And so they were very, very good. They were very good shots. The Germans were convinced every British soldier had a machine gun, which they didn't. But they were just that good at shots. But that won't last for long. Once you start lining up in rows to shoot at each other, and you'll start losing some of that. But the British involvement and the Belgians fighting slows down the German line considerably. On top of that, the Russians moved faster than anybody thought they could. And because the Russians are going to move quickly, the Germans are going to have to pull troops off of the Western line. They're going to keep shifting that line left, meaning inward, away from the sea. And as they move their line further and further inland, and further inland means further left, okay? I'm trying to do this way so that you can see it. And as they shift further and further left, which is reversed for you guys, one of the things that you see here I give up on the trying to mirror things. Okay. As the German line shifts further and further inland, one of the things that happens is that they're moving to a point that when they swing that flank, okay, when they turn, they're not turning as far south as they need to or as far west as they need to, so that they can, here's Paris. They need to come behind Paris. And they're not going to do that because they've had to pull more and more troops off. Partly they've lost troops to the Belgians and the British, and partly they've had to send them to the Russians because the Russians mobilized way faster than anybody thought they could. Because of that, the German line keeps shifting left, and with that, when they do swing, when they swing around, they're in front of Paris rather than behind it. And so they're not going to take Paris in 6 weeks. It's just not going to happen. So instead, we're going to get this. Okay, now you can see this better on here. Here's where they began to swing around. They swung around here, okay? And when they did, I'm not apparently going to be able to annotate my thing, okay? When they swing around here, you'll see them, the line comes right in front of Paris. Now, they're not going to be that far in front of Paris, but it's far enough, okay? And right through here, and you'll see the Marne River right through here, the Germans are advancing, and what is known as the Miracle of the Marne, the French line will actually hold. They will manage to keep the Germans from entering Paris and going any further into France for the time being. That line there north of Paris is pretty much where the fighting's going to stay. I'm going to go back to my map for a second. You can see here, this is the German line, and this is the Allied line and where they initially push it to, and then where it comes back to. And there is the Somme River. And the reality is they're going to fight right through here. There's Verdun, there's Saint Michel, there's Cambrai, there's Mons, there's Ypres, which nobody knows how to pronounce. You'll hear it Ypres, you'll hear it Ypres, you'll hear it Wipers when the British are really annoyed with this town that nobody knows how to pronounce. Arras, Amiens, Chateau-Thierry, all of these, and the Marne River and the Somme, all of these are going to be major battles in the First World War on the Western Front. And sometimes they're going to have 2 or 3 different ones at those same locations. The Western Front becomes a stalemate because where you saw the lines on that map are precisely where they're going to be until we get to 1918. So for the next 4 years, this is where they're going to fight. Now, nobody expected this, except for perhaps one guy. His name is Ivan Bloch. Bloch was a railroad man in Central Europe. He's actually a Czech. And he writes this book in 1898 that nobody pays much attention to, called The War of the Future. And what he says is that the next war the Europeans will fight will be a stalemate. Now, nobody pays any attention to him. But the reason he says that is because your defense is stronger than your offense. You simply don't have enough to break through the other guy's defenses. The defensive technology was that good. And so what happens is you're going to get trenches dug across France and Belgium. Trenches that sometimes look like this and sometimes look like this. They are nasty places by and large. The French, some of the French trenches are better. Some of the German trenches are better because they're on higher ground and they can kind of dig into the side of a hill and take their time. The British and the Belgian trenches tended to be much more slapdash. And it also depended which trench you were in. There were 3 rows of trenches in most places. And the further closer to the front line you were, the worse the trenches were. And the 3rd trench back, it's not bad. And that's where you slept and ate and had medical quarters and some things like that. Middle trench was for moving things up and people up and back. But you had 3 lines of trenches, 13,000 miles of trenches dug in this small area between Belgium and France. Some of these places, I mentioned that Verdun that's behind me, that you can't actually, there's places that you can't go because there's unexploded mines still. Whole area that you just can't farm. Well, in these places where they had trenches, farmers still 100+ years on dig up bodies that were covered in mud and were unrecoverable. And now they're there. So this defensive technology that was better than the offensive. What do we mean? What was this defensive technology? Well, the one that you expect is machine guns. Okay, machine guns were there, and if you've seen any kind of Old West picture, they're there. They are often mounted guns at this point. In the Old West, they called them Gatling guns. But the reality is it was a rapid fire machine gun, and it could you didn't have to be accurate. You just had to aim in the right general direction. It'll get it done, and you can mow down a whole row of people from a stationary spot. Barbed wire was also a new thing. Now, barbed wire had not been really used in combat before. It had been used to create fences in the Old West. It had been used to create detainment camps in South Africa, but it had not been used in warfare. Well, now we're using it to create a barrier from you to me, and now I just have to wait for you to get stuck in barbed wire. Now I can shoot you with my machine gun, and we're done. Okay, you're not going to get any further. There are also some other nasty pieces of business like flamethrowers. This is one shot of the flamethrower brigade in the First World War. This is pretty deadly business. So if I don't catch you with a machine gun when you're caught in barbed wire, I can catch you with my flamethrower, and you're also not going any further. Okay. But what about getting you before you even get it to me? Well, welcome to chemical warfare. The second half of the Industrial Revolution was all about chemical warfare. It was all about chemicals, diesel fuel, electric light. We're going to see new chemical formulas. Shampoo is invented in 1906. Yay. But also lots of other chemical things were being invented. And some of those were not so nice. Now, one of the most kind of ubiquitous pieces of chemical warfare was mustard gas. The mustard gas was not the only gas used during the First World War. So I brought you this lovely little thing here. And you can see that we've got tear gases, we've got chlorine, we've got phosgene and diphosgene, and don't criticize my things. But you see this. First used 1914, first used 1915, first used 1915. And then the loveliness of mustard gas, which is first used at Ypres in July 1917. Each of these are really nasty pieces of business. Now, tear gas was not fatal. Chlorine gas was. Chlorine was devastating. Eventually, they developed a gas mask. They're going to put gas masks on. They're going to put gas masks on horses, on donkeys. And yes, they have horses at the front line during the First World War, as we'll talk about in a moment. So they're going to do. This is going to be everywhere. Now, mustard gas is got, like you see there, about a 2 to 3% mortality. And you've got also this phosgene and diphosgene gas, which is colorless and odorless, and it's a really nasty piece of business. And it has about 85% of the gas fatalities were this one. Mustard gas is also pretty nasty. It's a yellow-brown color. You could see it coming. Mustard gas is not always fatal. And unfortunately, sometimes it's almost worse because it's not fatal. This is one gentleman who's had most of his face just messed up entirely by the gas because he didn't get his gas mask on or got it on only partially, so it ruined his face. This is what a cosmetologist has done to help him figure out how he's going to go in. He's basically got a false nose with glasses that he doesn't need. So what most people would see as a joke thing, that false nose and a mustache, is actually covering up a fairly serious war wound. And this is one where he's got most of his facial structure intact, whereas others, I mean, there's just gaping wounds for these guys. Mustard gas was particularly nasty. At the end of the war, most of the supplies of it are actually sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic so that nobody can get this again anymore. Ha ha. Welcome to the internet. It's not just that the defensive technology was better than the offensive. It's that how they used it was they didn't know what to do to get over this fact, which shapes what the war is like on the Western Front. And the reality is that battles all tended to look the same, at least for the vast bulk of the war. From 1914 through until early 1918, the battles looked very, very similar because they just didn't know what to do with this technology. Their battle plans, neither the Schlieffen Plan nor Plan 17, nor plans between the British and the French, none of them incorporated the use of technology. They just didn't plan on this. But that's normal. No battle plan survives the first 5 minutes of contact with the enemy. 5 minutes. Because you can't plan on what the other guy's going to do. But these guys try. And as a result, what they wind up with is what we call an ad hoc war. They're making it up as they go. And quite frankly, they're not doing a really good job at it most of the time. Battles were all similar. I'm going to talk about the Battle of the Somme. Battle of the Somme, this particular battle ranges from July 1st of 1916 to November 1st. Now notice this. This is different from what you saw in the Napoleonic Wars. In Napoleonic Wars, a battle would last a day, okay? Um, maybe 2 or 3 at most. And that would have been something unusual like Waterloo. Most of the time it was over within a day. You knew who'd won. And this is why the warfare didn't always affect people at home as much. It's because the battles didn't last very long. These battles did. And this is not seasonal warfare. This is warfare that goes on for all year round. And battles become campaigns that last for months. Now, the Battle of the Somme, and this is a battle, and there's a couple of different battles of the Somme. Some of them they call the Passchendaele, some of them they call Ypres. They change the names around a little bit by focusing on one particular area of the battle so that they can differentiate. For the Somme, what happens is that the Germans occupy the high ground. And because the Germans occupy the high ground, they have better position for guns and they have better defensive works. Okay. So here's you are down here in your trench, and with your guns kind of back here. When your guns are going to aim at this guy here, well, he's up higher than you are. So what's going to happen is when you shoot at him, your guns may try to hit up here, but what they're going to do is they're going to go underneath and into their little trench, into their foxholes, which are hidden in the side of the mountain, sitting in the side of the hill. It's not a mountain. And all of a sudden, you're protected. And so with the Germans occupying the high ground, it's really difficult to bomb that out of positions. Artillery barrages would last for days and days and days. Well, if you keep shooting at me for like 2 weeks, I know you're coming. Okay, so they prepare for you. And after the artillery barrage is over, then you get up out of your trench, going to charge across no man's land, the land between the trenches, and you're going to charge across and shoot them and take their positions. Except they know you're coming. And now we've got these guys lined up in a row shooting at these other guys who have better position and machine guns and flamethrowers and tear gas and barbed wire. Oh, yay. And you don't have a tank yet. This is important. The very first day, 57,000 people are killed at the Somme. That's a number that's hard to even process. One day? Up until this point, the greatest single battle in all of British history, okay, that with the highest death toll in the British Isles was like, according to differing reports, about 28,000 people in one day. We've just doubled that in one day. And we're not done. We've got months of this and this. Because this is what happens when you get out of a trench and the other guys have the high ground and a machine gun. This is what happens. They reached the first objective of what they wanted to get, how far they wanted to move the territory on the last day of the battle. The battle lines are just not moving. Most scholars will put that totals killed here somewhere around 500,000, largely on the Allied side, with an average casualty rate for the duration of this about 6,600. That's a lot of people. Now, most of the time, you're not going to be losing 57,000. Most of the time, you're going to be losing a couple thousand a day. But that's still a couple of thousand a day as a massive rate of loss. Now, they will eventually develop some new technology to deal with this. But the tanks come in later in the war. So when they do come in, they're going to be important. But until they get there, what do? Well, you keep trying, but you don't really have a solution yet. Meanwhile, you got to live in these trenches. And life in these trenches gets a little weird. We call it the strange life of trench warfare because you lived in sort of this half-life It was never really day, it was never really night. It was hard to tell what time of day it was, except like at sunrise and at sunset specifically. Sunrise was a really good time of the day. There were lots of strange things that happened. The strangest is probably the Christmas truce of 1914. Now, I provided a link on Canvas to the Christmas truce of 1914, and it's a chocolate company's ad, but it tells the story very, very clearly. And what happens in 1914 is both sides of this war are linked. Most of them celebrate Christmas. They celebrate it the same way. The Germans have given the Christmas tree and Christmas patisserie and cakes to the world. And so there's this odd moment in 1914 when the sides decide to have a truce for Christmas Day. You're not supposed to fight on Christmas. It's the old concepts that come out of the Middle Ages. Is you don't fight on a holy day. And Christmas is probably the holiest day of the year, short of Easter. So we don't fight on Christmas. So the guns stop. And you're supposed to just have peace in both sides. But what happens, oddly enough, and it starts in certain areas. Now, where the Prussians are, those particularly very militaristic Germans, this does not happen there. But where the British and some of their German cousins were, like the Bavarians, it did. In one place, the Bavarians actually baked a Christmas cake and shared it with the British on the other side of the fighting line. One place, they start together, the troops on both sides sing Silent Night together. And the next day, they play kickball out in no man's land. And the next morning, they're supposed to go back and fight against one another. The reality is they didn't. They shot over each other's heads, and eventually those above them figure out that this didn't work. You can't ask people to share a meal and share camaraderie with one another to go back to fighting the next day. It doesn't work. So they swatched out, the Germans did, about who was fighting whom. This unit that had some interaction with these guys on this side of the trench and this trench on the Allied side. They'll move these guys up the line to face some other guys and some other guys here. In one particular instance, the Bavarians were known to shout it out at the British, "Y'all keep your heads down. Tomorrow the Prussians are coming." And they're mean. The trenches varied, and it was a strange kind of thing. You were 30 minutes from Paris, 30 minutes from a warm bath and shows and nightlife and electric lights in Paris. And then you have to go back to the trench again and fight. You could get a weekend furlough. You could be home in London within a couple of hours. You could get all the way to the north of Scotland, spend most of the weekend there, come back, and your hometown looked like it did before. Now, maybe it has a few more hospitals, a few more wounded, but a lot of life stayed kind of similar there. And then you had to go back to the trench. It was this weird disconnect. Now, those weekend furloughs became rather helpful when you weren't getting the supplies you needed to fight. One really odd instance, a commander of a unit commander knew that they were about to go over the top, what they called over the top, because you would climb up out of the trench and run across no man's land to the Germans on the British side. And so he knew they were about to do this. And so they're going to encounter barbed wire. They know this, but they don't have wire cutters. So he goes home on a weekend and goes to the local hardware store and buys out the wire cutters and hands them out one by one to his men. It's a weird war. It's a really weird war. It's also weird because they got a lot of dead time. You're sitting around in a trench waiting for the other guys to attack. That's what you're doing. And because you are, well, what do? Well, Can't write the great British or French novel because you don't have that much paper. But you got scraps. So you could write a little bit of a poem on it. Why so much poetry? Well, they've all gone to school. And in school, they were taught a lot of poetry. And so they know how to write a poem. And they don't have a whole lot of time. Well, they do have a lot of time, but they don't have a lot of paper. We're dealing with toilet paper shortages now. That's nothing compared to the trenches in World War One. So you didn't always have as much paper as you'd like. And so there, you come up with lots of different poems. Some of them are certainly upbeat. Some of them are really not. Some of them are rather dark. One of the great World War I poets is a fellow by the name of Wilfred Owen. Now, Owen's story is very tragic because he doesn't make it out of the war. He's actually killed in November 1918. He's the last kind of barrages of the war where they're trying to fire off as much ammunition as they can before they're supposed to stop to use it up. And which seems a really strange idea to me, but that's what they do. And Wilfred Owen is killed as a result of that. But he writes this poem called Dulce et Decorum Est. Now, Dulce et Decorum Est is the first lines of an old Latin saying that it's sweet, which is dulce, and honorable, decorum, to die for one's country. Okay. And what he says is this: bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge, till on haunting flares we turned our backs, meaning the gunfire, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot, all went lame, all went blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone was still yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man caught in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friends, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. He says this is a lie. He sees it as futile, the whole business of, and there's no glory to be had. And guys like Wilfred Owen are going to contribute to our modern ideas about war. Our modern ideas about war are born in the trenches, the mud and the blood of the trenches where you're worried about your feet. Did you notice someone lost their boots? They worry about their feet because they're standing in mud and standing water and other fluids. They're living in boxes that are about half the size what they need to sleep in. They're living with mud and rats. It's really gross and nasty. And if you don't keep your feet dry, your feet can begin to rot off of your body. We call it trench foot. So you're going to get a lot of people who are going to get feet amputated, not because they get blown off, although that happens too, but because of the conditions in the trenches. Others are going to be like Siegfried Sassoon, who has humor coupled with other things. Good morning, the general said. When we met him last weak on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and were cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both by his plan of attack. There were soldiers who got very frustrated with what they saw was the incompetence of their leadership, simply because, well, you were following the same plan and it wasn't working. And you don't change the plan. We just do it again and again and again. But not everybody agreed. I've given you a link on Canvas to the Wipers Times, which if you can find the film, I highly recommend it. Wipers Times is a true story, and it's about some engineers who helped shore up the trenches, who happened upon at the Somme a printing press. And so, from February of 1916 until December of 1918, they print a newspaper, a soldier's paper, which they do their best not to have anything to do with poetry. They sometimes put in poetry, but the major, the guy, the captain who's in charge of it, doesn't really like it at all, poetry. So he doesn't want to print it. And what's fascinating about this little movie and the true story that they're telling is this French newspaper was making fun of those in power. And there's a sense of humor here. But they also make fun of what's going on in the trenches, and they mock it, and they talk about the silly things that are happening. And it displays a sense of humor in the midst of warfare, not the futility of Owen, not the anger of Sassoon, but rather humor of, well, we're here. We have to do this. This is a job we have to do. It has to be done. And lots of stupid stuff happens that we need to make fun of. Okay? And so there are lots of different reactions to the life in the trench. But certainly there is a sense that we're not really solving a whole lot in this trench that comes out of this. But not all of it is bitter, and not all of it is going to feel like there was nothing that they were fighting for, which sometimes can be the overriding image we get out of World War I. But if you go back and look at the soldiers, that's not what they thought. But there was a problem. They weren't getting out of the trench. So how do we solve this? Well, our battle plans on the Western Front are not helping at the moment. So what about the other pieces? Well, there are other parts of the war besides the Western Front. We could go to the Eastern Front against Russia. We could settle things there. Maybe if the Russians would win their war there, then the Germans would surrender and we could change things. The Eastern Front, though, has a lot of problems. Here we are in the Eastern Front. Now, one of the problems with the Eastern Front is that the Russians aren't prepared. They don't have all of the supplies that they need. They don't have the guns, the war material. They don't have the railroad lines to get it there. That's also a problem. And even worse, though, the Tsar himself goes to the front. Tsar Nicholas II is a fatalist, and he's a very, very devout man, a kind man in a lot of ways. But he's not a really great king. He's not a really great Tsar. Much like what we saw with Louis XVI, there's a lot of similarities here. He goes to the front himself. Now, the reason this is dangerous for a leader is that when you go to the front yourself, if your generals make a mistake, you can't blame it on anybody else because you were standing there and let them. Now, at home, he's left the mystic Rasputin in charge. And Rasputin, I deal with in my printed lecture. Rasputin was a mystic who could slow the hemophilia and the bleeding of the Tsarevich, the heir to the Russian throne. But he was also a man who liked his orgies. And the Russian nobility, to their credit, does try to get rid of him multiple times. They stab him, they poison him. He simply won't die. Finally, they have to stab him and throw him in the icy river. And you can cue all of those of you who have seen the animated Anastasia at this point. With very little surprise, Russia's losses in the war, which are many, and the problem of the Tsar being kind of to blame for a lot of this, and the corruption of the court, is going to begin a revolution in March of 1917. The surprise is not that they have a revolution. The surprise is that they last until the spring of 1917, 3 years before it happens. And the Germans at this point get probably one of the most brilliant ideas that they've had of the entire war, because they're going to ship Lenin, who's been exiled from Russia. Once again, more in the printed lecture on the Russian Revolution, back to Russia in a sealed boxcar, because he's not getting out in Germany. We can get him in Switzerland, stick him in a boxcar, ship him back to Russia, and let him cause as much havoc as he wants to. He gets there, and he begins a new phase of the Russian Revolution in the fall of 1917. Actually, he gets there in the summer and begins to change the nature of what's going on. And by 17, we begin what is known as the October Revolution. This is going to be the communist revolution in Russia. And Lenin comes up with the most brilliant slogan ever. I have no idea what just happened there. Hold on. His brilliant slogan is peace, land, and bread, all power to the Soviet. Now, the Soviet is a workers' committee. So he's saying all power to the workers, really, here. But he's specifically talking about those in these committees who are part of the Communist Party structure. Peace was designed to appeal to the soldiers who were losing so badly at the front, land to the peasants, and bread to anybody who was starving, peasant or worker. It was a brilliant slogan, and it's going to propel him and Russia into the radical phase of the revolution. And that's and under Lenin, we're going to see Russia move into this communist phase, which will last for, well, the next 75 years. Now, so with the Germans winning and the Russians not doing very well on the Russian front, the Eastern Front is really never going to be something that helps break the stalemate of the Western Front. Another option that was thought of early on in the war in 1915 is to go a southern route. Now, the southern route, this particular brainstorm, was that of Winston Churchill, who's a pretty young fellow at this point. And it's called the Gallipoli campaign. Now, the Gallipoli campaign is not a bad idea. What it means is that you're going to come down through the Mediterranean and come here at the mouth of the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, and attack here and come up this way through Austria-Hungary. That's the idea, is that we'll join up with the Romanians and break the Eastern Front and come in here and help the Serbians against the Austrians and go this direction. That's the idea. It's not a bad idea. It's the execution. It's the problem. It's supposed to be a surprise attack on the Turks. The Turks are the man of Europe. Certainly this should have worked. It's going to use primarily Anzac troops, Australia and New Zealand troops from the British Empire, though they are not the only ones there. There are going to be some French troops and some British troops, and it's going to be a mixture. So Australia and the New Zealand troops take a lot of the casualties, which is why you usually hear of them. But what goes wrong? Well, and there's the Australian and New Zealand troops. There's some aerial surveillance of the area and some bombardment in February of 1915. And that aerial surveillance and some bombs that are dropped and some things from some of these planes actually creates a problem because it alerts the Turks that somebody's watching this area. And that really loses the Allies the element of surprise quite thoroughly. The attack begins really in April. You're going to have some of it in March. But even by March, you've completely lost the element of surprise. And so when the troops begin trying to land in April of 1915, the reality is it's just not working. And they will continue to let it not work until the beginning of 1916. There will be over 500,000 casualties. The Allied casualties will be about 300,000, and about 250,000 on the Turkish side. So somewhere in the 650,000 range, give or take some. It's a nasty piece of business. And it gives you a real idea of what would have happened if Normandy doesn't go right for the Allies. Okay. One of the reasons why in the Second World War they're going to keep such tight security on the D-Day and landings is because of what happens at Gallipoli. Because of this, Churchill will resign from the Admiralty. He'll resign from the government. He'll go fight in a trench in Belgium for about a year. And because he's accused of malfeasance over this, but an investigation clears him. They say the plan is not unsound. The problem was the execution of it. The Anzac troops never have completely forgiven the British for this mess. And if you see the film Gallipoli that stars a very, very young Mel Gibson, he's like in his early 20s. He's very young. You would think that the enemy that they're fighting is not the Turks, but the British. Because that's really the incompetence of the leadership here is what's going to be the issue. Now, another way of breaking stalemate is, in fact, technology. And there is a lot of new technology in this war. Now, we've talked about chemical warfare and the flamethrowers. Now, machine guns and barbed wire were not new, but they're going to be used differently here. There are some brand new pieces of technology used in this war for the first time. And this is the very first air war. Now, first flights in the early 19-teens, 1910, 1912, with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. There are also going to be guys in Europe trying to do this. If you get really interesting, there's a lovely film called Those Fabulous Young Men and Their Flying Machines, and it showcases some of the crazy attempts at flight in the early portion of the 20th century. But the reality is that this is the first time we've seen it used in a war. Now, most early aircraft are not designed particularly well for warfare. They have a dual wing. They aren't enclosed. Most of you're open to the air elements. So if there's a bad storm, you can't fly at all. It's just not the easiest sort of thing to do. It was difficult to bomb places. You could, but usually they had to be handheld bombs, or you had to have some sort of rig that would allow you to pull a pin and drop a bomb below you, and the accuracy wasn't always that great. Most of the time, there wasn't a good way to do this. They were better for kind of reconnaissance. More often in terms of aerial warfare, it was more like jousting in the air or playing chicken with airplanes. I have my plane and I'm shooting at you, and you have your plane and you're shooting at me. Sometimes they didn't have, in early days, they didn't have guns mounted on the planes. They just had their pistols, and they would fly close to each other and try and shoot each other with a pistol. So it's like an old-fashioned duel. It's really not the most effective sort of thing. The Germans use Zeppelins a lot. They use Zeppelins for scouts, for raids on London, which began in January of 1915. But there were also some romance. This is kind of the last aristocratic warfare. These tended to be guys with money. These were not, just regular infantry people. And certainly in Germany, they were well-to-do noblemen. Guys like Manfred von Richthofen. This is Richthofen. This is the real-life Red Baron who shows up in the Peanuts cartoons and battles Snoopy. The Red Baron, he's called that, and he's called an ace because he actually makes a so many kills in the air, and you had to make 40 kills, legit, verifiable kills of another plane, in order to become an ace. He's going to actually destroy 80 planes. Okay, that's an amazing figure. He was an exceptional pilot. He's actually going to have commissioned for him a new type of plane called Fokker, which is going to have a tri-level plane. He's going to have another set of flyers around him. Hermann Goering, who's going to be very, very young in this war, much younger than Richthofen, will actually eventually fly with what is known as the Flying Circus, which is, in fact, Richthofen's unit. They're called that because all the planes are going to be brightly colored. That's why they're called the Flying Circus. His plane will be painted red in the center of the plane. Richthofen is actually going to eventually be shot down. And for a long time, it was thought that this gentleman here, whose name is Arthur Brown, and you can see a little bit of Richthofen there with the Flying Circus behind him and his 3-level plane there. It was thought that this Canadian flyer, Arthur Brown, was the one who had shot him. Recent re-excavations and re-investigations of the documentation of what happened here, and there was an investigation at the time, it just wasn't well publicized, and other things were going on in the war, and it kind of got lost in the annals of history. Richthofen was not shot down by Arthur Brown or Snoopy. He was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the ground, and that's what brings him down finally. The air war amounts to very little other than these kinds of interesting legends and interesting side stories. They are eventually, by the end of the war, going to be used more effectively as a weapon, but they're really for about scouting, a few bombing runs, but they don't move the line on the Western Front, and that's the key thing. Well, what about naval warfare? We had that grand Anglo-German naval race, and we built dreadnoughts and all of these great ships, and we're not going to have much warfare at all. The one major battle is going to happen in 1916. Now, there are a couple of other naval battles, but the most significant that had to do with the Anglo-German naval race is the Battle of Jutland in May of 1916. This is a pretty nasty piece of business for the British. It's the first naval battle loss for Britain in over 100 years. They haven't lost. They certainly didn't lose at Trafalgar, and it's a really devastating blow in a lot of ways. But the problem is while the Germans will win the battle, they won't win the war. This is what we call a Pyrrhic victory. P-Y-R-H-H-I-C. Pyrrhic, it's called that because of a Greek general by the name of Pyrrhus who fought the Romans. And he won battles, but he won them at too great a cost. And because he won them at too great a cost, he lost the war. He lost more than he could afford to lose. And that's what happens to the Germans here. The Germans actually beat the British, but they don't have enough left to follow up on the victory. And so the Germans actually have to retreat back to their ports along the North Sea. And the British simply call other portions of the fleet home from other places in the world. They call it home, and they still control the North Sea, even though they lost the battle. It's a nasty battle for the British. They lose a number of ships. They follow this up, though, by blockading the Germans in port. And the Germans don't have enough strength to break the British battle line of their battleships. So they resort to something brand new, the submarine. And the submarine is really key for the Germans, both in this war and in the Second World War. Now, the submarine was new as an effective weapon. The submarine had been tried in battle before. Leonardo da Vinci actually had designs for a submarine. There is a submarine attempted in the Revolutionary War called the Turtle. It's not particularly effective, and they sink. There is, in fact, for the Confederacy, an actual submarine. If you go to Charleston, it's actually there. They uncovered it, or they discovered it in the harbor at Charleston, where it sank eventually. But this time, the submarine in the Confederacy, this particular one actually did sink some ships. It did do some damage before it suffered some malfunctions and sank itself into Charleston Harbor. They keep it wetted down with salt water lest it completely deteriorate. But the reality is despite, we have had some in the past, this is the first kind of mass usefulness of the submarine. But the submarine represents some problems in the approach to war that was acceptable at the time. Now, this is these fleet yards there in Germany for the submarine, and they had quite a number of them. The big problem is the rules of naval warfare. The rules of naval warfare said that you weren't to attack non-combatant ships. And you announced your intention to attack, okay? Now, sometimes you announced it by firing at the other guys. But it was always, they have their flag and we have ours, and it's obvious who the other guy is, and, they're going to be attacking us very shortly. Now, unless you're a pirate and then you attack everybody, okay? But the pirates have already kind of gone downhill here. So the problem is with this is you are also not just supposed to announce your intention, you are also not supposed to let enemy sailors drown. You were supposed to take them on board your ship and then allow them to be ransomed back by the other side. That was the norm. Sailors didn't want to see other sailors drown. It was kind of unnerving for them. But that doesn't work with a submarine. A submarine's designed to be a sneak attack. So it's really an ungentlemanly form of warfare. On top of that, this is not a ship you can put prisoners on. That's just not what you do with it. And the trouble is fighting this way causes problems before Germany for other people. Because while the submarine is going to be effective to a point, it's also going to be problematic and bring other people into the war, notably us. The United States' entry into the First World War is a really interesting piece of things. Because we're going to stay out of the war for a long period of time because it seems to be more of a European sort of thing. And Washington had established the precedent of we stay out of European wars because there's a lot of them. Well, three things really prompt U.S. entry into this war. And it's our entry combined with several other things that will eventually break the stalemate of the Western Front. Now, the first major problem that we have that begins to kind of draw us into this war is the Lusitania. Lusitania was a passenger ship which sailed in May of 1915. The Germans had said that they were going to sink the ship, largely because it was believed and was actually carrying materiel for the British war effort. So they're going to blow the ship up. It's a passenger liner. Americans were sailing on the ship. The Germans take out ads in New York papers saying, Americans don't sail on this ship, we're going to sink it. And lo and behold, they sank it. They sank it, and it went down completely in 18 minutes and took down almost 90% of all of its passengers. About 1,100 of the 1,900 passengers die as a result, or go down with the ship. Many of them Americans, some not, some Irish, some British. It was carrying war material, but it was a nasty piece of business. and does not go over well with the Americans. Of we're neutral, you did this within sight. This is a ship coming into New York Harbor. How dare you do this? It wasn't the only thing that the only ship that that was problematic. It's the most horrific one. And it makes the Germans back off on what was called unrestricted submarine warfare, which means we're going to use the sub the way we would now use the sub of basically we're going to attack anything out there. Well, in May of 1916, the Germans are beginning to get in a tight spot. Neither front is moving for them. The Eastern Front, the Russians are holding on longer than anybody thought the Russians could. And then the Western Front is just sitting there being a problem. So what do we do? Well, they decide that unrestricted submarine warfare is the only thing they can do. And in May of 1916, after laying off after a lot of pressure from the American government, in May of 1916, they lift it. Now, this actually causes a lot of ships to be sunk. About 5,000 Allied ships are sunk at the cost of only 178 submarines, which is significant, honestly. And the reality was the subs were doing a good job of kind of hitting into the British war effort. Now, not sufficiently. The British still had a pretty stranglehold on Germany. It was not really relieving Germany. The German ambassador to the United States will actually resign over the creation of this policy. He feels like this is a bad idea and it's going to anger the Americans. And so he resigns. And his resignation brings in a new guy who is much more amenable to this name. His name is Zimmerman. And he's going to give his name to the Zimmerman Note, which is notorious in diplomatic history, because this particular little issue is going to be one of the major reasons why the United States comes into the war. Now, Germany, because she's blockaded, in order to get a message to a neutral party like the United States or even Mexico, Germany has to send their communications out through things like through neutral territories and get them in through other places. And so it has to go out through like the Swiss or the Dutch, and then from there it goes through London, and then it has to come in all the way to the United States. The trouble is that Zimmerman sent a message not to the United States, but to our southern neighbor, Mexico. Now, the United States in 1917 is having tremendous issues with Mexico. We are supporting one government. There's another government that's more popular, or another candidate is Pancho Villa, and there's a civil war, and we're supporting one guy, and it's a mess, and I'm not going to get into it. But needless to say, Mexico's not happy with us. We're not happy with Mexico, and Germany decides to use this with some encouragement from the Mexican government. And so the Zimmerman's note is a note from the Germans to the Mexicans that is intercepted by the British. And the British actually get the translation and the decoding of the message to the Americans before it actually gets to the German ambassador in Washington over this. And so what does the SOT say? Well, the Germans actually say that if Mexico will come into the war on the side of Germany and declare war on the United States, then when they all win the war, then Mexico can have Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico back from the United States at the end of the war. Very European idea that we just reshuffle the territorial boundaries at the end of a war. The Mexicans are actually kind of interested. But this is very much an act of war against the United States. To try to encourage somebody else to declare war on us, that's an act of war. Very, very typical of Kaiser's diplomacy, honestly. The United States is furious. This is going to be made known to the United States public in March 1st, 1917. And the public furor over this is just huge. There are a couple of attempts to kind of not go to war by some handfuls of senators and who are going to try to stop it and do for a time. But by beginning of April, it's going to be a mess. And April the 4th, Wilson makes an address to the joint houses of Congress and asks for a declaration of war. He will get it. It will be approved by the Senate and the House. And the United States is at war with Germany by April the 6th. Now, so it's April 1917. The United States has just entered its first European World War. And so we have a problem. We don't have an army. Belgium has a bigger army than we do. The only army we've got is down there on the border fighting Ponte Villa. As a couple cavalry units. We got a couple cavalry units with some forts in the. That's it. We don't have anything else. Got nothing, because we don't actually believe in a standing army at this point. And so we have a problem. What to do? Well, the senior fellow in our army at this point is General Black Jack Pershing, which should be here somewhere. There it is. Well, that's the Zimmerman minute. There's Black Jack. Black Jack Pershing is a really critical figure. He is the second highest ranking military officer in the United States military. Even now, he's second only to George Washington. George Washington outranks him only because of a special measure of Congress in 1976. I love my music, but my music just keeps kind of making my videos lag. Black Jack Pershing had been chasing Ponte Villa down along the border, and he's given this. He's going to be the general of the armies. It's a very high title in the U.S. military. Like I say, he's second ranking only to George Washington, and Washington outranks Pershing because in 1976 for the United States bicentennial, the United States Congress decides that Washington really needs to be the highest ranking military man in U.S. history. So they backdate Washington's promotion to a rank that didn't exist, that we only created for Pershing. And they backdate it posthumously to Washington back to the 1780s. But back to Pershing. Pershing's a key figure because he makes some really important choices here. He is going to be the head of the U.S. military efforts at this point. So he decides that the United States does not need to fight by simply folding U.S. soldiers into existing British and French units, which was an option, was something that could have been done, had been done with other militaries. This is not something that was unimaginable. But he decides, no, the United States needs to fight as a unit. But to do that, he's going to have to create the army. The ranks, we have something of that, but not any kind of modern thing. It's been a while since we did this, in any sort of organized fashion. We don't have any kind of training program. We don't have any kind of standardization of units and how he creates this out of whole cloth. This is the reason why he's so well thought of in military circles. In fact, he's going to have on his staff a couple of lieutenants, one by the name of MacArthur and another by the name of Eisenhower, who will both serve with Pershing. In fact, Eisenhower goes to see Pershing, and several of the other generals do, right before they go off to fight in the Second World War. Now, this has an interesting effect on the U.S. home front. We're not going to be as affected as the French, who are going to have their countryside ripped up, or the Belgians, or the Germans, who are going to suffer horribly in this war, or the British, who are going to be, tuned into to the war effort, and are going to have women who are making great sacrifices at home. We're not going to have homes that are turned into hospitals or women who have to go to work in factories. None of that will happen on the United States front in the First World War. But what it will do is create a sense of patriotism in the United States, and give us something that's unifying in a way we haven't had since the Civil War. We see drives by the United Daughters of the Confederacy for young men to sign up to fight for the Union. What? To fight for the United States? and you have recruitment drives by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It's kind of weird, but it represents the first kind of unifying effect for the United States since the Civil War, and it's a really turning point kind of moment. The United States coming into the war is also a turning point in the fortunes of the war. And it's a very critical piece of how the Allies actually win this rather long war. 1917 represents some changes, not only because the United States enters the war, but because the Russians are also going to leave the war. And the Russian Revolution begins in March and has fortunes changing across the summer. And by November, the communists under Lenin's begun to get a good hold on the government. Lenin realizes that he has to make good on his promise. His promise was peace, land, and bread. First piece of that was peace. I must, in fact, deliver on a peace treaty. I've got to get out of the war. And that means peace with the Germans at any price. And that's a dangerous place to be in when you're having to negotiate a treaty. Now, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is a really nasty piece of business in terms of a treaty. Yes, the Russians are losing and need to get out of the war, but the treaty terms are going to be pretty egregious. To kind of give you an idea, what you see here is where the original where this line is right here, okay, the dotted line right there, kind of west of Warsaw, is where initially the German and Russian border was. The pink line is where the fighting line was at Brest-Litovsk. The Russians have already lost massive battles at Tannenberg and at Masurian Lakes and several others. It's been a pretty bad war for them. But you can see they've still got a good chunk. They've still got the Ukraine and Kiev, which is one of their kind of founding centers. They've also still got their bases in the Black Sea and other things. But the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is going to take all of that. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is going to move the line all the way back here, okay, to almost to the Don River. Take all of Kiev and all of the Ukraine and the Crimea and most of the Black Sea ports. All that they're really left is this really small piece at this top of the Sea of Azov. And the Crimea is where the Russian Black Sea Fleet was. And so all of that is gone. It's going to be redistributed amongst the Central Powers. Germany getting this chunk, Austria-Hungary getting all of this, and then the section over here around the Caucasus Mountains between the Caspian and Black Seas goes to the Ottomans. Pretty nasty piece of business. Why in the world would you agree to this? Because Lenin's got to get out of the war. And Lenin believes that worldwide revolution is coming soon, and so this isn't really going to matter. This is a massive treaty, and this is going to take away 1/4 of the Russians' arable land. It's going to take away 1/4 of their industry. It's a nasty treaty. Remember that when the Germans start complaining in a minute. But with Russians out of the war, the Germans pull all of their troops and send to the Western Front. And they actually begin to make some progress and push the Allies back in the early portions of 1918. For the Allies, the spring of 1918 creates some, brainstorms, for lack of a better word. And they begin to come up with some new and inventive strategies, which are finally put into play really in the summer of 1918. And there's some of it's done in the spring, but most of it by early August, which is really key because the Americans are beginning to arrive. The Battle of Amiens, and there's multiple battles of Amiens, It's a really critical turning point battle in how the war is going to be fought and what eventually ends the war. Battle of Amiens in August of 1918 is really the last battle that the British really fight by themselves in this war. And it's a battle where Amiens has been cleared. Um, the the front line is only about 11 miles from Amiens. The town has no civilians left simply because the Germans are going to overrun it at any moment. But the British have finally figured out a method. It's called the combined assault method. And that means that basically you use your artillery fire differently than what they've been doing the entirety of the war. What they've been doing is massive barrages, which let everybody know that you're coming, and then you run up over the top and you fight in lines and you shoot people and you die. Nobody goes anywhere. Now we're going to use an artillery fire that's more focused and targeted on specific things and changes direction a little bit. And it's not going to be this big build-up barrage, but it's going to be used as covering fire when our guys are running across the field. That's going to be combined with a new weapon, the tank, as well as some cavalry, as well as airplanes, which are going to be spotting and doing some dropping of bombs from, that are handheld, but primarily going to be used as spotting. We're also going to combine the use of cavalry, infantry, cavalry, literal cavalry, and the tank, as well as aerial support and artillery. We're going to use these all at once to actually move things forward. And the Battle of Amiens is going to see more movement on the Western Front than they've had the entire war. In fact, it smashes the German line and pushes them back heavily. We'll also see the beginnings of aircraft carriers that begin that summer. United States soldiers begin to arrive in the spring in full force in July, and that gives the Western Front and the Allies more troops than they've had. Yes, they're green, but they're not bad. They're good troops. And so what we begin to see is this full force push to push the Germans back. And the Germans, by the fall of 1918, are beginning to be in real retreat. But they haven't really crossed all the way into Germany. They have crossed into Germany to a point, but they have not hit Berlin. Germany was running out of men. Germany was running out of food. The average caloric intake in some areas was down to 800 or 900 calories per day, sometimes places less. But Germany doesn't get invaded. And the German High Command very much sees this. The military men see this as a serious problem, and they're like, no, we're going to lose. And they feel like that they're going to get the same kind of deal that they would have if the war had ended in early 1915. And they're kind of living in a dream world. This hasn't changed the nature of warfare at all. But the German High Command seeks terms. But Germany wasn't invaded. And so for some soldiers and some German civilians, there was this feeling that they hadn't really lost the war because Germany wasn't invaded. And that's the beginnings of what we call the stabbed in the back theory, that the German military really didn't lose the war. It was the bureaucrats who did this. And we didn't really lose. We just got stabbed in the back. And this is going to affect how the Second World War goes for a number of reasons. One of those soldiers who's going to go to sleep seeing the war still going on and wake up, get wounded, that the Germans have surrendered and not going to understand why, is going to be a fellow by the name of Adolf Hitler, a corporal. The problem is, and why one of the kind of errors of this period, is that the United States, Woodrow Wilson, refuses to negotiate with the Kaiser. Now, this is a flawed concept. The Kaiser was the legitimate government. If anybody's going to have to surrender, it needs to be the Kaiser. He's been the driving force. He needs to surrender. But the United States, we need a democratically elected government. You're not Yes, he was legitimate, more so than any kind of strung together legitimate democratic government. Well, they pull it together and have basically a revolution from above in November of 1918 and create this little Republic government, the Weimar Republic, and ousts the Kaiser. But it puts the Weimar Republic in kind of a strange position because the very first thing you have to do as a government is surrender. It's not easy to surrender no matter who you are, no matter when in the life of your country. It certainly doesn't need to be the very first thing you do. And that puts things on a bad front. But anyway, the Kaiser flees to the Netherlands, and who will not extradite him for war crimes. Um, he'll be tried in absentia, actually. The Weimar Republic will surrender and end the war. And the German High Command will immediately begin to build this stabbed in the back theory where, well, it's not our fault. We didn't lose this war. It's these people who stabbed us in the back. The Germans sign a surrender, and negotiations will begin. The surrender, the armistice, will be signed on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. That's when this fighting ends. And that's why we have Veterans Day on November the 11th. Veterans Day is the only national memorial that we have to, in fact, the veterans of World War I. Now, there's a movement in progress to put a memorial in Washington to honor the veterans of World War I. And there are a lot of them who are in local areas as well. But this is the National Memorial, this Armistice Day Memorial. Now, the war itself is going to destroy the countryside and a generation. Towns all over France and Belgium look much like what you see behind me at Verdun. And we've talked about the unexploded mines and the bodies that are still unearthed. You can't really farm there for a little while. There's just too much gunpowder in the soil. So it's not going to be a particularly pretty picture. To give you an idea, I'm going to change my background for just a second and show you what it looks like at Passchendaele. This is close to the Somme, and kind of gives you an idea of, this is them crossing a little wooden plank bridge that they've done there. This is what it looks like around the Somme. They pretty much bombed out of existence things. And that's what the countryside in France and Belgium looks like. 13,000 miles of trenches. It's a really nasty piece of business. Not quite certain why it did that. There's also some other nasty little things. You've heard a lot about the Spanish flu in the last several weeks, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But most likely why the flu strain happens that it does in 1918, 1919, and it lasts even into parts of 1920, actually, is because it probably mutated in the trenches. And in those really odd conditions, it changes things significantly. The total dead is just an astounding number from World War I. And let me kind of give you an idea. What you see here, this is the Central Powers. The total dead from this war, just military dead, are 9.5 million. Germany's going to lose 2 million of that, the largest single loss of any country in the war. About 4 million for, in fact, the Central Powers. For the Allied powers, Russia certainly loses a lot. They lose about 1.8 million men in battle itself. And the total Allied dead is about 5.4 million. Now, I want you to notice something about the Americans. The United States is in this war from 1917 to 1918, but we really are only fighting for maybe 6 months. And we still lose 114,000 men in that very short time frame. That's a lot of guys. we lose more guys in this little chunk than we do in all of Korea, which lasts for 3 years. And our number of dead in Korea and our number of dead in Vietnam don't really reach this either. I think it's like 53,000, 53 or 54,000 out of Korea, and it's about 58,000 out of Vietnam. So it's right there on the edge, but World War I, we lose more men. It's a really nasty war. It's very deadly. The medicine has not gotten caught up to our ability to damage the human body. But there will be a lot of memorials everywhere. Memorials everywhere, and go look at your local courthouse when you can get out again, and you'll see names of the dead there at the courthouse. It's all over the United States. If it's all over the United States, here it's constant in Europe. Whole villages disappeared because troops were recruited together in one village, and they went over the top out of the trenches together, and they died in no man's land together. Or they came back quadriplegics, having lost both arms and legs. This one is the officers working in the post office who gave their lives in the Great War. You'll see these little kinds of these memorials everywhere. I spent an afternoon in London once going around reading the monuments, and by the time I was about halfway done, I'm just crying in the middle of the streets of London because I'm reading all these memorials. For some, this means a loss of ideals. How can you believe in democracy or in anything after this? And some are that way, not all. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings has not lost all hope, don't get me wrong. But he has his vision of war that you get of the industrialness of the war machines of Sauron against the natural kind of warfare of the wizards is very much and the hobbits is something that's born of the First World War and the kind of destruction that you see behind me. And he has this great scene at the end, and it's actually in the film, where the hobbits don't quite fit in after their experience of war. And that's true for a lot of men who came back from the war, who had this disconnect between what they'd experienced and what was going on around them. This is the first war where we really talk about shell shock, what we now call PTSD. And this is a serious, serious problem for a lot of these guys of trying to adjust back to While some felt like they'd been saved, others felt lost. In fact, the writers of the 1920s are often referred to the lost generation. Hemingway, Fitzgerald. These guys are in search of purpose. And the reason is that they've lost a lot of their ideals in the mud and the blood of the trenches. And the war memorials don't really help much. For some, the war is going to get rid of class barriers. It's certainly going to change the nature of the relationship between the European powers and their overseas empires. But the war is also going to have some other consequences. The treaties that will end the war in the halls of Versailles will not solve everything. In fact, many of them will not be changed. We will see lots and lots of problems. We'll also see some changes for Russia that I address in my printed lecture, that Russia's government's going to change entirely. The reality is that World War I shaped ideas of the Middle East and Russia and Europe and nations all over the world, including the United States, where it acts as a unifying power. World War I has a very, very long reach. And I'll see you next time, on Friday, actually, of this week.